All right, it's just about 11:30, and so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Robin Hudźnowski. I am a professor in the school psychology program at Lehigh University, and I am honored and fortunate to be here with a great group of colleagues and moderating this interactive discussion on cultural considerations, generally speaking, in measurement development. And I want to start by emphasizing that none of us on this panel have the answers to the questions with which we've been grappling. We're all in different places in our journey to better understand measurement development and application within a social justice framework. And part of this process has been reevaluating what it is that we know or what we've come to accept as the standards in measurement development, and then seeking alternatives to those standards and processes. So our goal this morning is pretty broad. It is to share our experiences with you as we engage in efforts to place measurement work in a social justice framework, and to use those experiences as a means of creating productive dialogue to move the field forward. So I thought it would be helpful to start out with a little bit of what has informed our conceptualization of this, of our work, and also of this discussion this morning. So we draw on two primary sources. The first is an article by Jennifer Randall that was published in 2021 titled "Color Neutral is Not a Thing, Redefining Construct Definition and Representation Through a Justice-Oriented Critical Anti-Racist Lens." And this was published in Educational Measurement Issues in Practice. In this paper, Randall proposes that, quote, "Because the assessment development process begins with the articulation of the construct to be assessed, so must the journey toward justice in our field. Our approach to construct definition and representation historically has often focused on minimizing what we might call construct irrelevant variance in an effort to move towards a more purely representation of the construct. But this approach certainly raises questions about what is considered construct irrelevant variance and by whom in the context of construct validity. And that leads us to our second source, which is Messick's work on test validity. So Messick suggested that the key issues of test validity are the meaning, the relevance and utility of scores, the import or the value implications of scores as a basis for action, and the functional worth of scores in terms of their social consequences, the social consequences of their use, end quote. So we want to use meaning, relevance, and utility this morning as a framework for sharing our work today. So each of our panelists will introduce themselves and describe their experiences in measurement development that have led us to question our approaches, our assumptions, and our practices. And so to that end, I will turn to our first panelist, Alicia Wackerly-Holman. And this is in the general theme, our first two panelists address the general theme of relevance and representativeness of the test content in relation to the domain.
Thanks, Robin. Just as a check, did you want to do introductions for everyone first, or did you want me to go ahead and talk about my projects in relation to the work here first?
I was thinking about you could introduce and talk, and then we'll move to the next person if that works for you.
Okay. As Robin mentioned, I'm Alicia Wackerly-Holman. I'm an assistant research professor at the University of Minnesota in the school psychology program here as well. And my work really is focused on early language and literacy assessment, multi-tiered systems of support, and parental engagement, kind of as a trifecta of ways to support children's early development. And in particular, a substantial proportion of my work has worked with multilingual learners, particularly Hmong, Spanish-speaking, and now some emerging work with Indigenous populations. And really, this is aligned quite thoroughly in our most recent work with the Jennifer Randall article that Robin just mentioned. And we've really been dealing with some challenging conceptualizations of what our construct should be and if they should evolve over time. So two really major issues that we've been grappling with are, how do we prevent sort of the homogenization of a cultural identity within a construct? So right now in Spanish, typically if you visit an early childhood classroom and you have Spanish speakers and there are assessments available to them, there's sort of one Spanish standard form, right? That all Spanish speaking children are often assessed in the same way. Historically, those assessments have been translated from English. So the construct is truly an English construct that then was translated to Spanish and applied to a Spanish-speaking population. Our work has stemmed initially into the work of changing the construct definition so it reflected how Spanish developed, and that emerging work was supported by 2 different IES grants. But now we've continued to grow in a way that has asked us to look more deeply at the heterotypic development of Spanish-speaking children relative to how their language profiles develop at home. So we think of bilinguals as simultaneous bilinguals, developing 2 languages at the same time, potentially from birth, as well as sequential bilinguals, children who sometimes are born into a household that primarily speaks one language and then enter the school system and another language is introduced, typically English. And our most recent data suggests that we can see different performance profiles based on those differences in relation to that subsection of the population. And that has given us pause about how we think about what we should be capturing, and if we're doing justice and capturing their full language profile and understanding that construct more deeply, or if it is indeed the case that their performance differences are due to truly meaningful representations of their ability and score in language and literacy skills. So that's one context there. And some of our other work in a different project is we've been thinking about storyline development. How do you ask young children to tell narrative stories, and how do you use that in assessment framework? That project is called CASA, Computer Adaptive Storybook Assessment. And that work has traditionally applied existing research on narrative structure, right? What do we think of as early childhood narrative structure and how children formulate a story? And there's companion research that's not centered currently in the US that suggests that different cultural identities have different conceptualizations of how story structure and narrative structure may occur based on cultural identity. And so we've been thinking about, should we employ, right, the more historically centered and white-centric approach, really, to thinking about what a story structure might look like. In addition to all of the aspects that are related to that, in the story structure, there are things like rising events, right, conflict resolution, in contrast to some of the nuances that we find in complementary research, particularly with African-American children, around nonlinearity in narrative, in Native American culture, around some of the moral frameworks that are used in storytelling there. So those are other big questions that we've been managing in the context of this idea that constructs are really an important constructs are an important feature, and the caveats to those constructs need to be considered outside of just construct relevant variants. That's one big picture there. Another thing that we're really trying to manage is, how do you take that information and translate it into a meaningful, scalable score that can be used instructionally? So part of the work that I do with IGDs is really fashioned around helping teachers know how to consume data in a way that will change their instruction immediately. Tomorrow, I can know how to do something different based on the data in this class, in this profile from the IGD scores. And in the classrooms, we have to think about the resources that are available to those teachers and how they understand the context. So this issue becomes doubly complex when we dial into, how do we help teachers understand how to consume the data in a way that lets them support all of the learners in their classroom, and also teach those teachers a way to really know how to identify what's the match between a potential measure and its constraints around a construct and the applied concepts that are going to be presented in an instructional framework for those children in the classroom. So those are two of the big issues that we're dealing with in the IGD work, and I look forward to discussing them further as we move into the interactive part of the conversation, and I'll pass it on to Tony.
And just to pause for 1 minute, thank you for introducing that part. We will have time, obviously, at the end for a much more interactive discussion. I thought it'd be helpful to get a context first for that discussion through the projects that folks are working on. Then we have some larger questions that were in the description of the session that will frame our discussion, as well as these individual issues that folks are raising. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Tony Albano. I'm faculty at the University of California, Davis, in the School of Education. I typically describe myself as a psychometrician, but a lot of my research focuses on validity issues in test design. And traditionally, we've defined validity and focusing on fairness in assessment in terms of construct irrelevant features. So Robin mentioned at the start of the session that this is one of the big issues that we're grappling with. How do you meld this traditional approach to creating assessments that are very sterile and devoid of any context, really? And as Randall discusses in the article that we reference, assessments that engage target students with a social justice lens. How do we combine those two, and can we combine those two? So one of the big questions that we're grappling with in an IS project that I'm on is we're focusing specifically on assessment in early math, where we want context to be important to the assessment. We want students to be engaged. We have a lot of fun imagery. You know, a lot of the math questions have traditionally been assessed via dots and really basic shapes that kids are counting. And we're using birds and fish and comets and planets and things like that. So it's been a challenge over the past couple of years. We're in year 2 of the project to figure out, you know, we're struggling as a team to identify the right procedures for like who are the key stakeholders in developing the assessment framework itself, the test outline, you can call it. How do you reconcile differing opinions on what context is engaging for different groups of students? You know, how do you collect that information? So there's been a lot of discussion lately about sort of crowdsourcing the assessment development process more, involving more voices in the process, like a community-driven assessment development. Those are the types of questions that we're struggling with right now. And at the end of year 2 of the project, we are having to kind of, COVID, of course, has pushed everything back a bit for us. So we have taken some extra time on this. It wasn't part of our original grant proposal to address social justice, anti-racist lens. So we're considering these questions along the way. But because of the stage that we're at in the project, this is where we're focused on the questions of who do you engage in getting feedback on assessment content? Is it just teachers? Is there a way to engage parents as well, maybe via survey or focus groups? Of course, we're conducting cognitive lab, think aloud with students to get their direct input on the assessment process, but we have a unique population of early preschoolers, ages 3 to 5, and you know how much feedback can they really provide in terms of their own personal experience and engagement with the process. And then, as I mentioned before, how do you put all this information together and then really standardizing the assessment itself? And that's kind of another issue that we can get to if we have time, this conflict between standardization and content that's directly engaging for a target population.
Thanks, Tony. Our third panelist addresses the theme of how the ways in which individuals interact with items or tasks serve to illuminate the underlying processes. And so, David, you want to tell us about your work?
Sure. Hi, I'm David Perper. I'm an associate professor at Purdue in Human Development and Family Studies. I'm going to talk about some of the questions that have been developed across my development grant, as well as questions that we've been grappling with through a few other projects over the last few years that connect with this project. So this project is a development grant to create and pilot a pre-K classroom intervention that combines both storybooks and guided play activities to support children's learning of early math language. Math language are those words and concepts that are really critical for early math knowledge, specific terms and concepts like more, many, most, a lot, same, similar, different, few, fewest, These are words that we've found and others have found to be really critical for acquisition of those early math skills. But one of the questions that has come up in our work as we've taken a parallel process of developing our books and our intervention materials in both English and Spanish at the same time is that within this specific content language, there are very few words that are cognates across English and Spanish specific to mathematical language. There are actually many of these words are more difficult words or phrases in Spanish than they are in English. Some are more tier 2 or 3 words in Spanish than in English when they're more often tier 1. There are also some of these critical words that don't directly translate across language. For example, the word most doesn't exist in Spanish. You would say something like la más or la mayoría, but neither of those have directly the same meaning. And so how does that play a role in the development of these intervention materials across both languages? How do we actually, how do these languages affect how we need to measure children's skills? For example, when certain words don't exist across languages, how do we account for this in the design of the interventions, as well as in the assessments that the progress monitoring materials that we build in for teachers? And how can we build in supports for teachers, for preschool teachers, to know how to assess children across languages, especially when we have these large gaps or mismatch between teacher language and student languages that seems to be only growing. This also builds into another question that we've been grappling with about how do individual children's experiences with language relate to our ability to measure their knowledge. For example, when we talk about this domain-specific language, do children have unique language or unique knowledge in each language, as well as joint knowledge across the languages? And how do we most appropriately build that into our assessments? Oftentimes when we, if you think about many of these large-scale assessment or measurement projects, such as like the ECLSK, for example, there's a screening procedure for how do you assess children in, or which language do you assess dual language learners in. They have to pass a screening test, and then they're either given the Spanish or the English version based off of how well they do. A lot of those procedures have been based off of work coming out of the language and literacy domain, but it may not necessarily translate to the mathematical domain, because the way that children receive math language input may differ than other input. For example, in some of our prior work where we've been working with parents and children, we've actually found that oftentimes we have roughly 30,000 minutes of audio recordings of parents reading books to their kids. We have bilingual versions of the books, and when we're listening to the audio recordings, what happens sometimes or many times for Spanish-speaking families is that they'll be reading everything in Spanish, and then when they'll get to the math, something that's more math specific, if they or their child start to count, they switch languages. And so just assuming that if their general language performance is better on one of these screening measures, that they should be assessed in math in Spanish, then it may artificially create these discrepancies in children's performance. One of the assessment projects that we had built into early stages of this work, we had assessed children, dual language learners' knowledge on the same measure across both English and Spanish. And when we compared to English-speaking peers that were a fairly well-matched group, and there was a gap in performance when you assessed or compared their knowledge in either English or either Spanish to their peers' knowledge of math. But when you used more conceptual scoring, where you accounted for their knowledge across both languages, there was no gap. And so we may be creating artificial gaps in performance when we only assess in one language. And so how do we build this into our progress monitoring? How do we support teachers in being able to do this, even if they don't speak Spanish? How can we build the supports into our intervention so that we can best know what children know, so we can maximize the instructional components of our intervention?
Thanks, David. And so finally, our last panelist focuses on the value implications and the social consequences of interpreting and using test scores when we think about both the intended outcomes as well as the unintended. Joseph?
Hello, everyone. I'm Joseph Rios. I'm currently an assistant professor in educational measurement at the University of Minnesota. Prior to joining the University of Minnesota faculty, I was a research scientist at the Educational Testing Service for 4 years. I've published on topics such as test adaptations for linguistic minorities and international assessments. Recently published a meta-analysis on test accommodations for English learners. And we also published a systematic review of score reporting practices for English learner parents. So I work with kind of validity and focusing on English learners and linguistic minorities in assessment, and also thinking more clearly about, validity evidence based on test content as well as internal structure, and thinking about, grappling with some of the issues raised recently by some of the faculty at the University of Massachusetts, such as Steve Cerisi, who has brought up this concept of under-standardization in the assessment process. And I think Tony touched upon this a bit of how do we grapple with being able to provide assessments that are reflective of the diversity of the student populations that we are assessing, while also making sure that scores are comparable. So that is an important issue. And then, of course, Jennifer's recent article, and making us think more clearly about how we define constructs. And I believe Tony also mentioned this, but the importance of bringing in stakeholders and the operationalization of the construct is extremely important. At the end of the day, what we're really talking about is assessment credibility. If the assessments aren't seen to have credibility, then they will be leveraged minimally to actually improve student learning in some way. So we have to address issues of assessment credibility, particularly as we've seen kind of a backlash in some context around assessment, and fairly so. So those are the major things that we're kind of grappling with in my lab, and I'm happy to be a part of this and hear this discussion today.
Great, thank you. So this is to provide a context for what we hope now will be a really interactive discussion. And as I was listening to everyone on the panel, one of the things that I thought about in terms of the practical applications, it feels like there's a general theme around how do we both realize and then maximize the potential benefits of assessment, starting with measurement development, defining our constructs, thinking then about how we measure performance, what is performance and what are the contexts we use to assess performance. And then finally thinking about how do we use those assessment results in both an inclusive and culturally meaningful way. We have some broad questions that we did put in the session description, and those I'll repeat for you here. And actually, if I can figure out how to do it, I'll put them in the chat for everybody to refer to as well, though we certainly do not have to stick to those. We had hoped this would be a broader discussion of the experiences that you all are having, as well as some of the efforts that you have engaged in to think about these issues in your own work. So the first question, and panelists, you should feel free also to kind of chime in on what you've done to address these particular questions. So the first one is, how do we consider issues of racial, cultural, ethnic, and linguistic bias in our development process, thinking from construct definition all the way to score interpretation? And I'm going to try, so I'll put the questions in the chat, and I'm also going to try and monitor the chat, but please feel free to take yourself off mute and raise your hand, and I'll try and monitor that too. Technology, unfortunately, is not my thing, but I will do my best to make sure folks are heard here.
I can speak a little bit to like where our efforts are with linguistic bias. I encourage the others to weigh in too. I think one of the, back to, I guess, Robin's original point, I don't claim to be an expert in this, and we're all learning, I think, about how to do this better. And so these are some of the approaches that we've taken over time, and I think our approaches are still evolving to improve. So I just want to add that caveat as we move forward. But particularly with Spanish speaking families and children, one of the things that we've done has been really strategic in our samples about including dialectical difference and representation in how we work with children across the nation. So for example, this year we have a study that's going to be studying Spanish speaking children in California, in Oregon, in Minnesota, and in Puerto Rico. So we're both leveraging where we think the most complete profile of Spanish language might look like in the United States, which we think of as Puerto Rico in our sense, right? Versus where we have a much more variability in what Spanish might look like. And here in Minnesota, for example, we have a pocket that is what we think of as Mexican Spanish, but then also Guatemalan Spanish, right? So we're trying really hard to make sure that we pay attention to those dialectical representations when we're interacting with the children and mapping those response patterns to how we calibrate and define item content. So for example, right, there are some words in Mexican Spanish that the same word has a very different meaning in Puerto Rican Spanish. And so if I have an item, right, that includes that word, back to sort of some of the points that David hit on, that's going to impact how I represent the student's ability and score. And so linguistic bias is one of the factors that rises to the top as very actionable and accessible in terms of design. There are many more factors that are much harder to wrangle, but that's one that our team is taking on and I think trying really hard to be very intentional about. I just noticed that Doug has a hand up. Doug, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm probably going to the practical too quickly, but we're struggling with these things with our own REMA assessment. And I wanted to ask you, and especially David, David, if I understood you, the using both languages is better. How and how do the different Spanish versions come into that? I think that's what you were saying. I just wanted the clarification on that. Does that remove bias? Just real quick background, 2 colleagues of ours here at the University of Denver moved to the United States fairly late in their career from El Salvador, and they swear that everywhere they talk to kids in English because they know more math in English than they do in their home language. So it's really a confusing kind of thing. So David.
Yeah, so some of what we've done is it seems as though the bigger differences tend to be when we have more linguistically dependent items like story problems, mathematical language, and things like that, where dual language learners seem to have pockets of knowledge in one language. They may have some knowledge in English, some knowledge in Spanish. This, one of the things I have to caveat this with is this is specific to the dual language learners that we've worked with, because we have to also recognize that Spanish English dual language learners are not monolithic. There's a great diversity in language backgrounds, just in terms of terminology that's used, but also in terms of family structures and the way that English and Spanish are used in the home. But what we have found that, and work by Barbara Seneca at UC Irvine has also found that for the more strictly basic mathematical tasks, things like verbal counting, in her sample of over 500 kids, dual language learners in preschool, I think it was almost every single one of them could count higher in English than they could in Spanish. And part of that is because a lot of that is often viewed as a school-based skill. And so a lot of the instruction they're getting relative to counting and happens in school, which also typically happens in English. And so there are contextual factors that play a role that we don't have a really strong understanding with specific to math and how that's happening. Some of it is maybe parents are switching across languages depending on what they're doing. Some of it may be dependent on schooling contexts. And so there are a lot of things relative to that to think about. But then also building off of something that Alicia was talking about, we spent a lot of time in our storybooks, especially in really working to make sure that we attend to language differences, not just for the mathematical language words, but also for the other words that are used, because a singular Spanish translation, if you create a measure in English and you just translate it into Spanish later on, you may come across many terms that don't or translate differently across dialects. For example, when we're creating our books, one of the first book, the main characters are they're packing their bags to go on a camping trip, and we're going to call it Too Many Marshmallows. But then the word marshmallow has multiple translations across Spanish dialects that aren't clear, that aren't typically understood across the different dialects. And so we recognize that that was a word that really wouldn't work. And if we use that, if we use that in the book or use that term in an assessment, if we may have different reliability dependent on dialect of the population that we're working with. So trying to identify words and terms for the background of our assessment development, I think is also critical to think about.
I just wanted to build on that. So there's a really rich literature of kind of dual assessment, dual linguistic assessment, and where an examinee has been provided with the assessment in their, say, native language and in the English language. And one of the things that we see is that there isn't any clear trends in terms of this overall effectiveness, because each individual brings their own linguistic background to the assessment experience. Although they may speak Spanish at home, for example, they may not have formal knowledge of the language, and it may not translate to academic Spanish. And as a result, there may be cases where an individual may not know either in English or Spanish the word that's actually being asked. So we have to be really careful not to generalize, because there is a lot of diversity when it comes both to that interaction of the individual with the assessment. And when we look at a lot of the test accommodation literature for linguistic minorities, we find that there are no general trends in terms of there being one overall effective accommodation. There's no panacea there, because oftentimes we're asking the wrong question. We're asking, is this accommodation effective for linguistic minorities? When instead we should be asking the question, is this accommodation effective for whom, and under what context is this accommodation effective?
And just to build on that a little bit, another piece that I think is relevant here is back to the MESIC framework about how data is used. So in this discussion around conceptual scoring that's sort of emerging right now, one of the things that we ran into early in our AD work, I mentioned that instructional relevance is really important in the way our measures are designed and for their purpose, is that when we gave teachers what we think of as a conceptual score that represented a total profile of a language, not separating out English and Spanish, they didn't know what to do with that. They didn't have good instructional strategies that could map onto how they support that. So we shifted to a model where we do assess in English and in Spanish, but they get a score for each that's actionable relative to the strategies in that language. And that became much more practical and accessible for them to be able to say, oh, I know that I can do this in Spanish this week to help boost their English development because they have these strong skills in Spanish, or another strategy in English will work here. And so that consequence of the data became very important for us, that we valued this total language profile, but we needed to provide it to the practitioners in a way that they could then consume it and interpret it as an instructional information to inform their instruction.
So I think a related question that I have, but we necessarily haven't talked about this as a group, but one of the things that I think about, particularly when we focus on language, and here we've talked mostly about Spanish and various dialects, although Alicia, you talked a little bit about your work with Hmong families as well. And so I think one of our greatest challenges, though, moving forward in the measurement field is how do we think about the multiple languages now that children speak, and cases where we may not have an ability to translate either in terms of from an English to another language, or even conceptually from what we were trying to assess in English to another language. And then how do you create a measurement tool that is both culturally meaningful in terms of the specific culture, but also generalizable to the kind of a construct of school readiness, if you will. You know, how do we decide what constructs are important to measure across all cultures, if there is one, and then how do we do it in a way that is both culturally meaningful and somewhat universal, if that makes sense? We have an opportunity to do some work with a group in Maine where the number of dialects that the children speak is incredible, and goes beyond kind of what the local, what we would think about as being easy to translate. So that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. And I'd love to hear others.
I just want to highlight that alongside of what Robin's saying in the chat right now, there's a discussion sort of regional representation of English in the United States, right? So this issue, of course, is not limited to what we think of as global majority languages. It's also the dominant language in many of the classrooms, and we've just not paid attention to it historically, right? We've standardized sort of a monolithic English standard, and there are a lot of new studies that have really paid attention to what are the nuances and fringes of that we should be paying attention to. So it's sort of doubly complex in that space. I think Hmong is a really interesting language to talk about in this idea of how do you create something that's generalizable across different groups, but also maintains cultural salience to each subgroup, because Hmong has, for those of you who don't know, Hmong people are from an area in Thailand and Laos, and during the Vietnam War, a lot of those families were refugees and came to the United States, and so their communities were broken up. Some of them were in regions of Laos where they relied on oral language. There was not a written language, and they identified their dialect by the color of the wardrobe that they wore in the highlands. So if you were green, you spoke Green Hmong, you identified with this sort of regional location in Laos. And so there are like 15 different Hmong dialects, and they go by color. In the content of the United States, the most popular are white and green. However, there's 12 others that have very small pockets here or there. And so we have to make these decisions about, do we just stick with white and green? What happens if we marginalize those other kids? What's the overlap in the content of the dialect? So all those variables are things that we have to consider, and when we make these discerning lines in the sand about which versions we develop and which versions we don't, and how we allocate equitable resources to those children. And those are hard decisions to make. If you identify with one of those more marginalized groups, to be recognized as a culture or an identity that's not recognized in the school system already puts a significant amount of limitations on your capacity to show your ability and skill and feel valued. Now you're stretching into the social emotional domain. So I think it rapidly gets complex.
Robin, to answer your question, I think about language, it's really important to think about going back to Messick's kind of concept of construct of relevant variance. Now, if language is central to the construct being assessed, then it should be explicitly stated as so in the construct definition. However, if language isn't a very critical component of the construct being assessed, then allows for a little bit more flexibility. And this goes to Cerisi's kind of concept of understandardization, which is a paper published in MIT, I believe in 2020, 2021, which really makes the argument that, we as psychometricians have been so focused on standardization as a means of test fairness. But by focusing on standardization, we've actually made the assessment process less fair for very diverse populations. And what he really argues for is that we can loosen up some of these constraints around standardization when we're not making direct comparisons to examinees. So for example, if the assessment is norm referenced in nature, we want the assessments to be as comparable as possible, just from a fairness standpoint. However, if we're making criterion referenced inferences, we're comparing a student to a particular standard, then our goal is really to understand where that student is when it comes to that standard. And comparability is less of an issue. And as a result, maybe we could be more attuned to the individual examinee's needs when we assess them, and thinking about things such as linguistic diversity, or thinking about maybe modifications to the way that we are currently assessing students. If we think about this idea of under-standardization, I mean, it's currently employed. I mean, there are some students that get test accommodations, and there are other students that don't get test accommodation in certain assessment contexts, yet we treat those scores as being directly comparable. And so I think that when it comes to the diversity of the examinee population, it really starts with the construct definition and us thinking critically about what are the linguistic implications and what are also the cultural implications for this particular assessment. And as I mentioned before, also getting buy-in from stakeholders of the assessment process. They have to feel comfortable with the way that we're assessing students. If not, then that automatically undermines credibility and it undermines the whole assessment development process.
Tony, did you want to contribute? And then I have two comments in the chat that I want to share too with folks, or you can, I'm sure you can read them too, but I'll say them aloud and see what the panel's thoughts are.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. Joseph makes a great point. I'll just add that a lot of our challenges with standardization are based on the fact that we rely so heavily on standardized curricula, right? So as we define constructs and struggle with how to make them engaging for a diverse student population, is our instruction engaging for a diverse student population? Are our standards, learning objectives, instructional objectives representative of a diverse student population? We have to make sure we're working together with the teaching side, right? Because we often we don't have the autonomy often to redefine a construct if it hasn't been redefined at the state standard level, right? So we're kind of constrained, I think, when we currently in the US, when we grapple with how to unstandardize or understandardize our assessments because our curriculum is so standardized. And a related point I'll just tack on, I've often struggled with, I've done some research on assessment literacy, so how prepared are teachers to interpret assessment results? We all talk, you know, at kind of a standardized level here. We're like a few steps removed from the classroom in these discussions, when teachers are really in the best position to adapt an assessment to their students' needs, right? And I think what we need to be talking about is providing them with the tools to identify a particular subpopulation of students or culture in their classroom and modify an assessment as needed. And this also hinges on what Joseph mentioned, which is whether we need assessment results to be comparable across students or not, whether we can be so flexible as to tailor them to the individual student without worrying about norm referenced comparisons.
That's a good segue into one of the first questions in the chat was whether the panel has a recommendation about thinking about Spanish speakers who take an assessment in English and whether their scores should be compared to norms based on English speakers or whether there should be different norms for that cohort, and what would be the pros and cons of each approach. And then there's some follow-up questions on whether it's better then to redevelop a Spanish language version that may have some aspects that differ because of those cultural adaptations. And if so, then thinking about comparability, how would we compare performance across different language versions? So maybe from your experiences, you could speak to some element of that question.
I think this aligns nicely with Joseph's comment about what is the construct, right? So if the construct of interest here is English performance, and the construct is defined as, in this case, maybe if it's language assessment or literacy, right? English language and literacy skills, then having English content on there in Spanish might be useful. If you're interested in what the child's language development profile looks like, different of their language, that's a little bit different, right? You're centering what is their home language profile. The construct is probably going to be in Spanish if they identify as Spanish. So now you have a different construct that you're defining, and so your items need to tap into that construct. So my personal opinion on this is thinking about starting from like, what is the core construct that you're trying to tap into, and then defining what assessment kind of questions are going to be the most useful in tapping into measuring that.
I would also add to that, that I think the purpose of the assessment is also important to weigh in here. We always try to standardize things and create standard scores so we can compare groups. But if that's not the purpose, if the purpose is to inform instruction, and we need to take, I would say, more of that learning trajectories approach, where we need to understand what it is that that child knows and where they need to be, and how do we best assess what they know. And so I think that is different than creating a normed score across or within groups or across groups. And so I think and that's one of the challenges that we've been wrestling with our progress monitoring, is how do we best assess what math language these preschoolers know, when many of the preschoolers in some of the samples that we're working with are dual language learners, but the vast majority of our teachers don't speak Spanish. When there's that mismatch, how do we assess that? How do we maximize our understanding of what children know?
And so there was a little bit of dialogue in the chat around kind of the generalizability of inferences that Tony addressed to some degree in his response, not reading the chat. And that with his idea that teachers are in a good position to be able to adapt some of our assessments. So the follow-up question is, can we collect information about teacher adaptations at a broader level so that we can evaluate their fairness and consistency, so that as we're adapting to a more local context, we can ensure that bias doesn't enter at the local level as well, even if it is intended to maximize performance or even with good intentions. So how would we go about collecting teacher adaptation, and how do we use that information?
Robin, I think this is a great question. And one of the issues that we have is the potential to introduce unintended constructive invariance, or there may be unintended consequences to potentially employing a particular adaptation of an assessment. And one of the things that we've seen, and maybe Tony can speak to this a little bit more than I can, since that he specializes in this idea of kind of data literacy, but also assessment literacy amongst teachers is pretty minimal. And many of the teacher training programs across the country, oftentimes they're not required to take an assessment course, although combined teachers are the largest test producers in the United States, bigger than Educational Testing Service and Pearson. So I think that there really is a need, if that is going to be something of interest, to provide teachers training around assessment development and thinking critically about kind of construct definitions as well. So I am very excited about the possibility, but I think it would require us to think more critically about that training process.
Yeah, so that's a great segue into another comment. So does the panel have suggestions on how to help teachers who already feel like they are spending too much time on data collection to find the time? This one was particularly situated in the linguistic context, so to find the time for assessing in both English and home languages. But given that end comment, we could also say, how do we think about scalable and feasible ways to involve teachers more in the data collection process, helping them understand also what it is that we're measuring, and how best to use that information. And then again, back to the linguistic issue, there's a specific question related to, for example, Alicia, what you were talking about, if teachers are not bilingual themselves or well-versed in a bilingual instructional model, how can we help them understand how to use data, the kinds of data that you were talking about? The full comment is in there, but I think that pulls out the gist. So if anybody wants to take that on.
Well, I think one effective, or potentially effective tool, and building off the IES grant that you're PI of, Robin, is working with some computer adaptive assessments that are done or that can be assessed across multiple languages without requiring the teacher to actually be reading the items and responding to students' answers and Robin, if you want to talk more about how we have that assessment put together, but there are ways that in future projects we can definitely develop even more components across different languages, and we've talked about this a fair amount. But there is a lot of need to really identify what is the best practice. Can we do it? So I mentioned earlier about how that one project we assessed in English and we assessed in Spanish on the same measure, counterbalanced different times. But that does take a lot of time to do. And so we've also explored other ways of starting in one language when they get something wrong, or when a child gets something wrong, switching to the other language to see if they know it in that language. But that may increase measurement error, giving them multiple times to respond to answers. And so I think we need to work out some ways that are more efficient to assess both languages, but we can't just assume that because we don't have time, we can't do or we can't do what's going to be best.
Just to add to that, and thanks for asking that, Trisha, I think the scalability issue is at a crux of a lot of the challenges that we face, and it's daunting in a lot of ways, right? I think in some ways it requires a paradigm shift that we're not there yet. It goes back to Tony's point about what do we teach in the classroom and how did the instructional match happen in relation to the assessment data that we give to teachers. In our experience, teachers want the data when they can see value in it. And so the data literacy practices are really critical in helping them learn how to consume that data in a way that they can see changes in child outcomes related to the changes that they make in their instruction. And then in terms of scalability, our current approach has been trying to be more holistic in that framework, leveraging parents whenever we can, setting home practices that can build a skill, like in storybook reading, probably Dave worked a line here, I imagine. So, and even some of your own work, Trisha. So I think that space is a space that we're exploring right now. We don't have a universal model to employ how preschool teachers who support Spanish speakers can learn strategies or learn how to speak to those children in a way that's effective. In our assessment modules, the bootstrapping we're doing are audio files that are related to, you can pick if you're Puerto Rican Spanish or Mexican Spanish or right now other dialectical frameworks, but that's a Band-Aid on a much bigger problem, right? And so I think this scalability issue is something that we consistently face and are trying hard to think about ways that we can employ these data practices, give high quality measures, and create something that's sustainable and that teachers will want to use and find utility in moving on. So I wish I had better answers to that question, but I think it's the work to be done still.
Anyone else have anything they want to share based on your experiences relative to involving teachers, as we were just talking about? I know we're getting a lot of questions, but I also want to encourage you to share your own experiences because I know a lot of you are doing very similar work. Okay, then I will take, there's another question in the chat about what's the role for statistical analysis to address some of the issues that we're talking about. For example, if we think about analysis of diff for various subgroups of the tested population.
Yes. We use Diff a lot to test our dialectical difference groups, our regional geographic difference groups, and then sort of the more standard demographic groups. I think Diff is one of those tools in statistics that often gets a bad or overlooked as a powerful resource. And we find it really useful to pull out items that show differential item functioning across two different identified groups. And it's another way to buttress demonstrating you are eliminating or removing bias from a measure, from a statistical lens. So sorry, I can't talk this morning lens. So I think Diff is a really useful tool here, but I'm sure that Joseph and Tony have much more insight on that since that's in their field.
Yeah, this gets back to something I mentioned at the very beginning around our traditional definition of fairness, which would be an absence of bias. So differential item functioning is a statistical method for identifying item content that potentially benefits or detriments a particular group of students. And if you find it, you get rid of the item. And so you incrementally go through your test and search for content that is least least offensive as possible, right? And the discussion we're having now in the past few years in the measurement community is, how do you move beyond that? Because that's searching for construct irrelevant variance and removing it, right? And what we're talking about, I think today a little bit, is how do you build assessments that are have more construct relevant variance for particular students, right? So it's kind of the opposite of looking for diff. And there's a good example of this when we look for items, when we build item accommodations and modifications for students with exceptionalities, we recognize that without these features in the test, they wouldn't be able to display their true performance, right? But if we add these features to the test, we'll probably, ideally, only be benefiting those students. And we refer to this as differential boost, but we still use diff statistics to identify it. So I don't really know how to answer the question. I'm not sure how we go forward with statistical analysis, because it hinges a lot on whether we're going to have a single score scale that works for all students, which implies standardization for a certain target population, versus breaking the assessment down and breaking the score scale down for different groups of students. Diff assumes we have a single score scale and that we're aiming for a construct, a single uniform construct, and probably what Randall refers to as a color neutral assessment, which maybe we shouldn't be looking for.
I would like to build on that as well. And I think Tony made a lot of great points. I would really caution against the use of relying purely on diff analyses, because diff analyses require us to match total scores usually, or observed scores on a particular assessment that we're interested in assessing for diff. Now, when we match on that total score, we're actually assuming that the scores are directly comparable across subgroups. However, one of the issues that we're trying to assess here is whether or not the assessment is actually fair for the students. And in many cases, the assessments may not have directly comparable total scores. So leveraging diff for the purposes of identifying problematic items is problematic in itself, because it makes strong assumptions that may not be tenable. With that said, I think that when it comes to identifying problematic items, this is where the role of collecting validity evidence based on test content is so important. Where we're going through the process and we're bringing in external experts to help us define our construct definition. We are having a diverse group of item writers write the items. Those can be practitioners, those can be a host of different folks that are bringing different perspectives to the item writing process. We're conducting things like content sensitivity reviews and bringing together community members from outside of the assessment world, teachers, parents, to actually assess the content, asking students about the content. There's a lot of work that can be done at the area of the test development process. And I think that's very critical. That's going to be able to tell us more perhaps than kind of the statistical analyses. There really aren't any statistical procedures that can account for a badly developed test. We can't fix that post hoc. So the test development process is the basis, the foundation for providing us with really strong inferences and valid inferences.
I just want to clarify that my comments about using diff were predicated on all of the things that Joseph just said at the end there, that you have a really sound, well-defined and a construct that is considered all those factors that he just mentioned. And then it's sort of one tool in your toolbox, but certainly is not the only tool.
So is there a way that diff analysis could be used as a component that actually informs the validity, use, interpretation of a score for individual children? And I guess I would add to that, one of the things I was thinking about is thinking, well, we remove items. Was there a way to look at it to say, well, what is it about this particular item or set of items that are boosting performance? And how do, if I want to think about about boosting performance more broadly, how do I incorporate some of those elements into my other items? Is that ever a direction we would want to go? So instead of eliminating things, we're looking at creating additional. That wasn't in the, that last part was just mine, just so that Robert doesn't feel like he got stuck with that end part.
I'll go back to Joseph's comment. Diff is still important, but it shouldn't be the only. We often develop a test, run our diff analyses, and if they look good, we assume, I mean, we also do sensitivity review if it's a large scale assessment. But after that, we kind of say our test is good, it's fair. We shouldn't rely solely on diff as a measure of lack of bias in our test. We need more voices and a more elaborate process, I think.
Tony, I want to go to one of the questions that you brought up too, in this idea of process and getting more voices and more input in that process is what are people's experiences been when you have engaged in some of that work and gotten perspectives of various stakeholders and you find that there are differences in opinion? So in talking about our project or situating in our project, some of our teachers have raised questions about whether the context we're using. So we picked what we thought were novel contexts for kids to engage in some math tests. So as someone mentioned, we have an outer space context, we have an under the sea context, we have a jungle context, and getting feedback from our teacher partners, some of them were concerned whether or not that was a context that all kids would feel equally comfortable in. In our child piloting, all kids were engaged with the context. They seemed to enjoy it. They made comments that suggested they liked the images that we used. So as we think about, I think Tony had two questions, like who are the stakeholders we should be including? And then how do we think about integrating the different recommendations that might come from those stakeholders?
I wondered for a minute if my Zoom had died. I think that's a tough question. Maybe that's why there's a pause. Yeah, there's no answer yet, I don't think. Surveys, being more open and transparent with what our test content contains. Like a lot of us are trying to keep it secure. If there's any stakes associated with an assessment, we want our content to be secure, so we're hesitant to release it. Maybe we need to let go of that security concern and be more transparent about what we're measuring.
I think one of the rubs in that comment, Robin, is that there is no way we shouldn't value one of those perspectives more than another, right? And so we don't want to fall into this trap of creating a stereotype about a particular identity group based on one collection of voices and have this other collection of voices that we eliminate from our process because of basically confirmation bias, right? Like, well, I thought it was gonna be this way, so we're just gonna stay on this path. And so that is a challenge, right? To figure out how do you push the design practices in a way that incorporates many voices, like Tony is capitalizing on here in that piece of it, and also recognize that that's gonna push the features of your design probably in uncomfortable ways, and not and be mindful of your own confirmation bias and try to reduce that, right? So I hear you saying like, well, we thought it would work, kids liked it, right? But what if there's something else there that we're missing? Or, like, I'm not trying to say that anything that you're doing is not right. I think it's what you're doing is great, but it's just a factor that we have to figure out how to wrangle. And I don't yet have really good strategies on how to create a practical framework for how to do that, but it's very important.
I was hoping actually someone would have some strategies we could use, because it is what we're grappling with. And I think it is what led us, and thankfully to some degree, we have a little time to do this, but to think more critically about our own thought process, right? Why did we choose the context that we chose? And we chose these kind of novel contexts. We thought our conversation was about, well, let's pick some things that, so we started with contexts that kids might have some experience in, but then we worried that old kids might not have experience in the grocery store, for example, or in a classroom. And so then we thought, well, let's take it out of kids' experiences, although some kids might be space aficionados and have lots of knowledge about space, but we thought, let's take it to these kind of more novel contexts as a way of addressing children's varying levels of experience. And then when teachers gave that feedback, but kids seemed to like it, it led us to, all right, well, what do we do next? How do we take these two pieces of information feedback and use them in the next step of measurement development? How do we test what our assumptions were and refine, revise, and move forward? So I was hoping that other folks, because we don't have a solution either. So I was hoping that folks might have some suggestions.
I think that understanding the depth of this, I think we keep kind of coming back to language as the construct of interest in some of these discussions, but there's a comment in the thread here around children's language system being sort of one underlying, it's not that they are half Spanish and half English or half, and I think that that's so critical to incorporate in how we think about this, because the perspectives that we gather from those voices are going to come from different experiences with the language, right? So some homes are going to have two languages in them all the time. Some are going to be dominant in one. And those two perspectives are probably going to be very different, just in the conversations that you even asked, Robin, about the circumstances of the space or the jungle or, whatever the contexts are. And I think on top of that, like the framework for how we help teachers understand that the language system, that kids are leveraging skills in all of their language resources, whether we want to believe it or not, right, as they're learning new languages. And so helping teachers see the value, and it's useful for you to know how much they know in their native language, because that's going to actually probably impact, we have studies across different languages around cross-linguistic transfer, what's going to happen in the second language. In this case, a lot of the time is English. And so I think that's an intersection that happens when these voices trying to figure out how do you gather input from a continuum of different profiles, I guess is a loose term for different types of how language is being acquired, and then seeing that as like one collective system, I guess.
So we may be hitting a natural stopping point here. I looked back at the three broad questions that we had proposed as part of this interactive discussion, and I think to some degree we've hit on a number of those elements. But I also don't want to cut off folks if there are other burning questions, comments, things that you want to add to this session. We'll do, I guess, a last call.
I just saw the comment from Ethan in the Carolyn, I wonder if you could speak to that comment.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
Okay.
Thanks, Alicia. No, I was typing to Robin like, hey, there's a new comment.
Yep, sorry, I didn't catch that.
That's okay. So yes, without a fundamental change to the RFA evaluation criteria, can this work be carried out as a particular emphasis? I mean, I guess you all can speak to this because you have current IES projects where you're doing some of this work and grappling with these issues. So the answer, Ethan, is that I do believe this is allowable within our current RFA structure, and we're always every year reevaluating how we can improve things and signal to the field that we want you to do more thoughtful and mindful work and think about some of these things. But I guess the short answer, given the time, is to say that, yes, this type of work is allowable. I know there are some things that were mentioned earlier that like, oh, this wasn't part of our funded project and not necessarily how we budgeted, but there's nothing to preclude you from budgeting for some of the things and additional activities that were discussed here. And that's certainly something to take on with the program officer, given whatever topic or area, if you're applying under our main education research or the special education research RFAs, to really talk to the program officers about sort of how you can incorporate some of these things and what to consider and how you frame things for the panel that will review and score it. So I hope I've answered your question.
I'm not sure if folks saw the links that I think Dr. Gomez put in the chat, but both of those papers are really great papers. So if you're interested, I don't know if they will disappear when it closes. So if you haven't downloaded them from the chat, I would encourage you to if you're interested in them. Thanks for sharing them.
One thing that I would add, just to cap things off, in regard to doing more work in the space, is that it really does, I think, require an interdisciplinary team, because there are very specific nuances to content areas. For math isn't just math. Like there's so many different levels of what is math and at what age point, and how is this all build into itself. And we can try to take some of what we've learned from language and literacy and apply it, but there may be specific differences that really require content area experts, as well as but also like building that content expertise with expertise in dual language learners and measurement experts, and building that real deep team, rather than trying to do it just yourself. It's been one of the things that, for some of the stuff that we've done, that has just been really critical, is having those multiple perspectives to help us make sure that if we don't just delete those items because of diff, like why would we delete them? What's causing the diff? Like how having the different perspectives, I think, is really critical.
That is an excellent point, David. And I think it applies to the other domains that was in one of Robin's original questions. So to race, ethnicity, culture, sort of really thinking about how you put together a multidisciplinary team with people from different backgrounds and areas of expertise to address all of those things, in addition to the linguistic issues as well.
And I think that's a great comment. We focus mostly on linguistic differences, but there are a whole host of other considerations in measurement development. And I think a nice way to wrap this, well, aside from making sure to give you a little time to download those if you haven't, there's a comment in here about all of our assumptions have to be perpetually examined. So outside of the constructs that I mentioned, this comment introduces kind of the construct of time, right? If we think about Bronfenbrenner and the chrono system, things change over time. And so the comment is about how currency, things like dollars and cents, are less relevant, less salient, perhaps for kids in elementary school as we move more and more towards digital forms of currency. So how are we constantly thinking about what it is that we're developing assessments for, and then using in practice from multiple perspectives? And that was one that I had not considered in terms of math yet, though I have certainly when I encounter a picture of a telephone, that's that old kind that hangs on the wall that probably nobody has, or the kind that you dial. So time is an element that we have to consider as well. Well, thank you all for joining us today and for sharing your thoughts and questions with us. And I hope that it was as productive for you as it was for us.
A great session, Robin. It went well. Great session, all of you. This was wonderful. I think people got a lot out of it. So thank you all for a wonderful session.
I was looking at the clock there for a moment and thought, oh my gosh, we are never going to make it to 12:45.
Yeah, I thought that for a second, but then the comments kept coming. That's good. That's good. So
Yeah, I mean, in this group, I feel like we could talk all day about this stuff. This is like the tip of the iceberg, right? And so
yeah.
there's just so much more to be explored here. But I thought it was fun and to talk to you all about it, and I really enjoyed it too. Thank you for inviting.
Yeah, well, thank you all for joining, because I know we were kind of fast and furious with this. One of the things that I thought was really interesting, and I'd love to think about this more, and it's related to your comment, Caroline, is we stayed in linguistics for a long time. I was trying to get us out with context, and I couldn't do it. I couldn't get us out, and it was too subtle of a way to get us out, right? But what I think, when I think about Randall's article, what I want us to have a good discussion on.
We should all bookmark it to talk, because they're literally going to cut us off in like a few seconds, Robin. They do that at the end of each session.
I'm sorry.
But let's follow up offline to have this conversation.
Yeah, let's get to some other topics. Okay, great. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye. Take care.